Okay, so I guess we'll go ahead and get started then. So in today's session, I'm going to be going through a spouse client file from start to finish. And it's going to be a really open-ended session. So if you have any questions, you can either just unmute yourself and jump right in, or you can send it to the Zoom chat if that's easier. So hopefully everybody can see my screen right now. And this is the screen that you first get to when you log into the system. And it's going to list all of the clients that you've added. So to add a new client, you're just going to go up to the add button. And for any client, the key things are going to be first name and last name. And those are the key fields you need to add the client to the system. So let's call this guy Ben Collins. You can put in a middle name, but it's not required. Then you have the email field. And this is here if you want to send the client the online questionnaire. Then you'd put in their email, you'd click that use questionnaire box, and then when you added them to the system, it would send off a questionnaire to them. And basically, it would send it by email, so they'd get an email that would say, click here to access your questionnaire. And then once they clicked into it, they'd be prompted to create a password just so that their information stays secure and so that they can do it in more than one sitting. They don't have to do it all at once. And then they just go through and enter in their profile, family tree, asset, and debt information into the system, and it will automatically populate back into your account. So it's a great way to save a lot of time with the data entry. If you want to see what the questionnaire looks like, you can add yourself as a client and use your own personal email to send it to yourself. The thing to note is you can't use the same email that's associated with your user account. So if you have like a secondary Gmail or something like that, you can use that to see what the questionnaire will look like. And then you just go ahead and add. And so today, since we're doing a spouse client file, we need to add both spouses as separate clients to the system, and we'll link them together using the spouse client function. So if you're just doing a will for one spouse and the other spouse is a beneficiary in that will, you don't have to do this. But this is if you're doing wills for both of them, then they both need to be added as clients. So let's go and add the second spouse. So we'll call her Lauren Collins. And then the key field here is this spouse client function. So when you're adding the second spouse to the system, you're going to click on it and you're going to click the name of the first spouse, and then they'll be linked together. So you can only do this spouse client linking when you're adding the second spouse to the system, because the first spouse needs to already be in the system in order for you to be able to choose them from this list. And now once I add them, they'll be linked. So that means that any family tree and joint asset information I put into one of their profiles will automatically appear in the other. And then I've also got the option to manually sync the scenarios and the appointments if those are going to be the same as well. So then once you've added them both, you just have to pick who to start with. So I'm going to start with Ben. So just click on his name to bring you into his profile. And then this is what you're going to start with. You're going to start with the client's icon and his spouse. And if the client had filled out that questionnaire, you would see whatever family tree they built. So if they built a large family tree, you would see it. If they just kept things simple, you would see that as well. But if you hadn't sent the questionnaire or they hadn't filled anything out in the questionnaire, this is what you'd start with. So usually what I would do first is I would edit the client's information. So you can do that by just double clicking on the icon. And then you can enter in details here. So the key things for anyone on the family tree is going to be first name, last name, and gender. You want to make sure the gender is changed just so that the wording of the will comes out properly. If there's an also known as, you can put it in. So if Ben's also known as Benny Collins, you can type that in and it will come out in the will. Date of birth. You can pick it from this little calendar thing, or you can just type it in. I find that easier. June 6, 1960. You can pick a country of birth. You can pick multiple citizenships or a single one. And then all this other information, this is good to have on your file on the client, but it doesn't have any effect on the actual generation of the will. So that's just for information. Then if you scroll to the bottom and you get to residency. So residency is important because however you set the province as here is how the system's going to know what documents to generate. So if you're from Ontario, then the default is Ontario. But if you're from Nova Scotia or BC, you're going to want to make sure the province is changed so that the right precedents are going to be generated. It also is how the system knows to calculate the probate tax when you're adding an asset. So it'll calculate it according to whatever you set the client's residency as. The city field's also important. So if Ben's from the city of Toronto, it'll say Ben of the city of Toronto in the will if I fill out that city field. Then for special circumstances, this is a place where you can note any potential capacity issues the client might have. So you would just note it off and then you could type in a description below. So this again doesn't have too much of an effect on the generation of the will, but it's good to have this stuff well documented in your notes, especially if you believe there might be some sort of will challenge down the line. And then direct relationships is the last thing. It's just going to tell you who they're tied to on the family tree. So right now this says that Ben is married to Lauren. And we'll save. So now if we wanted to add a child, what you do is you click on the icon to get the blue circle around them, and then you add to them. So if you double click, it's going to bring up more information. But if you just click once, it'll get that blue circle around them. And that's going to be who you're adding to. So if I wanted to add Ben's child, I'd make sure the blue circle was around, and then I go to the add button and say child. And whenever you're adding a child, it's going to ask you who the other parent is. So it's going to give you three options. Is it the current spouse, Lauren? Is it a new parent, so an ex-spouse that's going to be involved in the will? Or is it a single parent? So either they're genuinely a single parent or there's an ex-spouse, but they're not going to be involved in the will. Then you can just put them as a single parent. But let's say it's Lauren. And then you're just going to enter the child's information. So say John Collins, male. And then if we scroll down to the special circumstances section, for anyone that's not the client, it's going to be a place where you could note any sort of relationship difficulties or estrangement. So that's good to have well documented, but also disability. This is the most important thing. If the individual is disabled, you're going to want to make sure that this button is checked off so that later on when you're doing the planning and the scenarios, you'll be able to create a Henson trust and the system will recognize that's what you're trying to create because this individual is disabled, and it'll draft that Henson trust clause accordingly. And we'll just go ahead and add. So if you look at the add list, you might notice there's no option for grandchild or niece and nephew, but there's still a way to get them on the family tree. You just have to do it through direct relationships. So instead of just adding a grandchild directly to Ben, what you have to do is add a child to Ben and then click on the child's icon and add a child to the child. And that's how you'd get the grandchild in. So now I can enter in the grandchild's information. Lily Collins, female, June 7th, say 2012. And that's how that works. Same kind of thing for nieces or nephews. You would click on the client, you'd add a sibling to the client, and then you'd click on the siblings icon and add a child to the sibling. If there's going to be anybody else involved in the will that in either a beneficiary or a trustee capacity that isn't family, you're going to add them over on this other tab right here so that you'll have their information in the will and you'll be able to select them later on when you're doing the planning. So let's say, for example, Jordy is going to be a trustee later on. So we'll add his information in here. Jordy Ayton, let's say he's a friend and male, and then we'll just add. So later on when we're doing the appointments, we'll be able to select him from the list. So that's the people section. Are there any questions so far? Nope. Okay. If you do, don't hesitate to unmute yourself or send it through the chat. So that's people. Then we'll get to assets. So on the Assets tab, you're always going to start with the general personal effects, just to remind you to gift them to someone in the will in the initial gift section. So you're triggering that special general personal effects clause. So if you want, you can add details, you can add values, but really it's more of a placeholder to remind you to gift it, so you're triggering the clause. For any other assets, you can add in all of the client's assets with all the values and give them sort of a rough value of their estate at this point in time. But really, for the generation of the will, the only assets that you have to add in are those that are going to be specific asset bequests or those that are going to be registered assets that you want confirmed or to do a new designation in the will. So those have to be added as assets so that later on, when you get to the scenarios section, you'll be able to plan with them accordingly. So let's add a couple assets. So we'll go up to this add button. We'll start with a bank account. So the key thing when adding any asset is going to be that asset name field. So it's just going to be called bank account as a default. But if you're adding in multiple bank accounts, or if you're not, but you just want to know what this bank account is identified as, I would put all the identifying information on the asset name. So call it like RBC bank account, whatever the account number is, so that if you're gifting it in the will, that's going to be how it's referred to. But even if you're not doing a specific gift of it in the will, it's going to be referred to as this throughout the system. So when you're planning and you have to deal with multiple bank accounts, they're not all going to be called bank account. One's going to be the RBC bank account, one's going to be the CIBC bank account. So you'll be able to differentiate and know which one you're actually planning for. The other stuff is just information. You can put a value in if you want, and it's going to automatically calculate that probate tax for you according to Ontario law. And then we'll just go ahead and add. Next, let's say we wanted to go real estate, home. Again, you can change that asset name. Maybe this is the family home if they have multiple homes. The address field, if you end up gifting this home specifically in the will, this field will populate and identify the asset in the will. If you're putting in a current value, let's say it's $1 million, you're going to notice that probate tax again calculates automatically. And then for real estate, if you do have a mortgage on the property, you're going to want to put the value of the mortgage in this field here. So let's say it's $50,000. Just because it's good to know what asset the debt is associated with, and also it has an effect on how much probate tax is calculated for this asset. When we get to the next section, which is called debts, you'll also have the opportunity to add a mortgage in there. But if it's associated with a specific asset, I would just add it in this section and not in the other section, because it has more implications here if it's tied to a specific asset. So usually best practice, if there's a mortgage on the property and you're adding that property in as an asset, just add it in this field and don't add it as a separate debt in the debt section, because you just want to make sure at least you're not adding it in both places, because it will double count it. So choose one section, but normally here is the best if it's associated with an asset. And then if you wanted to change the ownership, you could change it from sole to joint, and then you're going to want to scroll down and click right on where it says add owner, and you can pick who the other joint owner is. Perfect. Let's do one more. Let's say we're going to do an RSP. So again, however you want the information sort of displayed, this is how you're going to put in the asset name. The beneficiary, that's just whoever the current beneficiary is on the policy. So you could type it in. It's just for information purposes. So once we get to the actual scenarios section, that's where you're going to be able to confirm the beneficiary or to do a new designation if you want. So this is just for information about the current state of the asset. For current value, let's say it's 100,000. So you notice that the probate tax automatically calculates, but the income tax doesn't. And that's just due to the variability of different clients' tax brackets. So what we usually do is we try to plan for the highest possible tax the asset could incur, just to show clients sort of a rough number. So for something like this, like an RSP, we would put in like 50% of it. And for something that has like an asset with a capital gain, we would usually do 25% of that gain as the value, just to give them a sense. So that's the asset tab. Are there any questions here? Nope. Okay. So next is debts. So again, you just go to the add debt. I would not put in the mortgage because we already did. We don't want to double count it. But let's say there's a credit card. You could just put in some information on that and then add. So that's debt. Then you get to scenarios. So at most, depending on your client situation, there's going to be these 3 scenarios for you to plan for. And then by creating a plan for each of these, you're going to cover your bases no matter what happens. So you start with surviving spouse. So what's the plan if the spouse is alive when the client passes? Then you go to descendants only. So what's the plan if the spouse is gone, but there's still kids or grandkids around? And then lastly, no descendants. It's like your ultimate disaster. What's the plan when everyone's gone? So that way, by creating plans for each of these, no matter what situation your client ends up in, you're going to have covered it. So you can do it manually by going into the scenario and doing things like starting from scratch. But if you're dealing with a typical client file, so a typical situation where it's like everything to spouse, then everything to kids, that kind of thing, you can go up to this little lightning bolt up in the top corner. And these are EPlans. So it's basically like a button that goes through and does the planning for you. So it's going to go through the scenarios and the appointment section and fill it out for you essentially according to the plan that you select. So the good thing about this is even if this is not the exact plan you would have wanted for the client, it's a great starting point. So you can use it as a starting point and then you can make any changes that you want. So like if it is a typical situation, at least the surviving spouse is probably going to be everything to the spouse. So that one's covered for you. And then you can go make changes to the other 2. So usually I like to run one of these as a starting point just to save time and then go through each one to make sure that I don't want any changes or to make any changes. So let's say I like the idea of this spouse with younger children. So it's going to give everything to the spouse, then everything to the kids in a 2-stage trust. But I'm going to change the numbers of that. That's okay. I'll get to that later. And then no descendants, it's giving half to siblings, half to spouses' siblings. I'm going to change that too. But at least some of this stuff is what I want. So I'm going to go ahead and execute this. So that way I'm not going to start from scratch. So I go into surviving spouse. Anything in the joint designated assets section, it's going to have already given anything that was joint or designated to the spouse, knows it's falling outside of the estate. In the initial gifts section, it's going to gift those general personal effects to the spouse. And then in the balance of the estate, it's going to give everything 100% absolutely to the spouse. There's no gift over here because the second scenario is the gift over, so I don't need to deal with that here. So this is good. I don't need to change anything in this scenario. So I'll go ahead to the second one. Probably no joint or designated assets. Initial gifts, it's going to give those general personal effects to the children. But let me just show you how I would do it manually if I needed to. So any specific asset requests are going to appear over here in your list of assets. You would just drag and drop it over. Then you decide absolute or trust. For general personal effects, you can do absolute. And you click on the beneficiaries line and you pick your beneficiary. So you can name the children specifically, or you can scroll down and just use the class. And that's how you do an initial gift. And then for the balance of the estate, if we want to see the details, we're going to click on the gray bar and then on the gray bar again. And it's going to show us that it's a trust for the children, the class of children. Same trustees as the executors. The duration is when they reach age 30, but I want to change this. I'm going to say when they reach age 25. And then for staged lump sums, it's got 50% at 25, but no, I'm going to change that. So I want it to be at 21, 25%. So I can make any changes that I want. And then the gift over is going to be first to beneficiaries issue and then to the other class members, so the other children. And then I'll go and save. And since I made a change to this scenario, maybe I want that change also to be reflected in Lauren's will as well. So what I'm going to use is this spouse sync button, which is going to copy everything I've done in this scenario, the descendants only, over to Lauren's profile. So it's going to copy the residue breakdown. It's going to copy any joint designated assets between the two of them. The one thing it won't copy is solely owned assets. So the system sees those general personal effects as each of their own solely owned asset. So I'm going to sync this over to Lauren, and then afterwards I would go into Lauren's profile and gift her general personal effects specifically. So I'm going to sync, and now it's copied over. Then the last section is no descendants. So this is sort of like your ultimate disaster when everyone's gone. So we're probably just going to be dealing with the balance of the estate here. And because we ran that EPlan, it's going to give 50% to the siblings and 50% to spouses' siblings. But let's say that I don't want to do that. I have a different plan. So I'm just going to press clear. So you can either just not plan for no descendants and leave it like that, or you can create a plan. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give half to Jordy for being such a great guy and half to a charity. So let's start with Jordy. So I'm going to create two segments. So first is going to be segment 1 for half, so 50%. And so I've kind of divided it up. So I've created a 50% segment, but I have to specify the details of that. So I'm going to do that by adding a gift. So it's going to be absolute to Jordy, 100%. This means 100% of the 50% segment. So I'm not dividing up this 50% segment even further. So I can leave that as 100. Let's say we're going to do a gift over to his issue. So now I've dealt with 100% of this 50%. So I need to go back and deal with the other 50%. So I'm not going to add a gift. I'm going to go back to this segments thing, this grayed out segments button. And then I'm going to go add segment 2 for 50%. And now I have to specify what's happening here. So if you've already added the charity to the system, just scroll down this list and pick it from the list of charities. But if you haven't added them yet, you can go to the 3 dots and you can go new charity. And then just type it in the name field. You can put their CRA number in if you had it. Ignore this ID. This doesn't mean anything. It won't populate anywhere. So you can just leave it. If you have the CRA number, put it directly in the name field like this. And then we'll go and add. So now we've dealt with everything here, and we can sync this over to Lauren as well. So that's the scenarios section. Are there any questions in this section? No? Okay. So then we will go to appointments. So here's where you're going to appoint your estate trustees and your guardians. So because we ran the EPlan, it's going to make the spouse the primary trustee. And to add any alternates, we're going to go add, and then we're going to pick our alternate, let's say Jordy. And if they were going to be a joint primary with Lauren, we would pick none, because anytime you set the condition as none, they're going to be a primary. If you put a condition on it, then that means they're going to be an alternate. Okay, thank you, Denise. So to make them an alternate, you're just going to say a condition. And usually I choose if all specified cannot act. So it's going to be Jordy. If Jordy can't act, then Lauren. Or sorry, it's going to be Lauren. If Lauren can't act, then Jordy. So it'll show us here. Lauren's the primary. If Lauren cannot act, then Jordy. If you wanted to add a further alternate, you could pick your individual. You could say your condition. And if I wanted him to be joint with Jordy, I would keep the specified as Lauren. But if I wanted him to be an alternate to Jordy, then I would keep the specified as Jordy, so that it would be Lauren. If Lauren can't, Jordy. If Jordy can't, John. So you're really just playing with the conditions there, and that's sort of how things work. So that's estate trustees. If your sync button for appointment is down in the bottom left. So if we wanted to copy this over to Lauren, you would just click sync and it would switch Lauren and Ben, so Lauren's not her own primary executor. And guardians is over here if you needed to do guardians. So the last thing we're going to do today is provisions. So the first thing is funeral arrangements. So you're just going to type them on that line. Oops. If not, you just delete it, delete the text, and there won't be a body disposition clause in the will. Include future members is how you want the members of a class defined. So if you want to include future children, it's going to define the children as John Collins and any other child born to me and Ben, or me and Lauren. So if you're dealing with a young couple, you're probably going to want to include future children if you're doing class gifts in the will. Class restrictions, this is the same kind of thing. You can restrict certain members of being part of a class. Then you have your trust for beneficiaries under a certain age. This is your general trust clause that will guide underage beneficiaries who haven't had specific trusts set up for them. So you can change the duration or you can keep it at 25. And then secondary will assets. This is where you can pick and choose which definitions you want included in the secondary will if you're doing corporate wills, so primary and secondary will. But if you're just doing a single will, you don't need to worry too much about clicking or unclicking. It won't have any effect on anything. So that's provisions. Then before I go to generate my will, what I usually do is click on this little exclamation point up in the top corner. These are advisor insights. So it's basically contextual information. It's like a checklist that's advising you accordingly on certain things. So it'll advise you if you've missed something. So I didn't put in Lauren's gender. I could go back and change that, and this advisor insight will disappear. But some of them are just for like your information. So request prior wills. This one will never go away. It's just always to remind you to do that. So it won't have any effect on the generation of the will if there are some remaining or none remaining. It's just more for your comfort and to know that you've thought of everything, you thought through everything, you're not missing any key important planning things. So it's a good resource for you. Thing beside it is just notes. So if you wanted to make notes on your client, you could type them in here. These notes do appear at the end of the text summary. So if you're going to be giving that to clients, just be wary of what kind of notes you include in this section. Usually I'd put in notes about maybe I needed to check the spelling of a name or note that I had done a title search on a property, something like that. Then the last button, that's the download button. So that's where you're going to generate your documents and your summaries. So first of all, there's 3 summaries you can generate. The first is the profile, and it's going to give you all the information that you filled out in your the clients filled out in their questionnaire, or that you filled out on your end, like we did today. So it's got all of the profile, family tree, all the details on the assets, and all the debt information. So it's just good to have on your file. It's got all the details. Then you got your nice graphic scenario summary. So it's like a visual representation of the will. It's sort of like a funnel. So you start with all your assets up here, and then everything funneling into the estate goes through the debts and the initial gifts, and it gives you the residue, and anything falling outside of the estate goes over here. Then your last one's your text scenario summary. So it's just got all the information on all the gifts and all of the residue breakdowns, everything you've done in the system. So it's like the will without the legalese. It's just got all the details. It's more of a digestible format for the clients. Then you'd go up to documents. If you're on a trial, you can just ignore this message, but that's when you would incur the fee if you're on the flex plan. And then you just go over to single will. You could change the signing date. You could take it out completely or you can leave it. Registered asset designation. This is if you want the registered assets confirmed or to do a new designation in the will. You would check that to include the clause. Joint designated asset confirmation. That's if there are any joint assets that are, if your client has a lot of joint assets with adult children and you just want something saying that anything that's joint is truly intended to be joint and not held on a resulting trust. Counterparts if you're signing in counterpart under the new legislation. Simplified provisions is a shorter will with less definitions and powers. The will guide is a nice sort of chart at the end of the will that guides you through the all the different clauses in the will. And then a cover page is just a cover page. And for witnesses, you can pick anyone else who's a user on your account, or you can just check this blank box and you can manually put it in the will. And then you can include your affidavits if you want. And then you just click generate. And it's going to give you a Word document. So that's fully editable. You can make any changes that you want. And it's going to be a will for you. So the first thing, this funds and plans, this is if you click that registered asset box. Assets passing outside the will is if you click the joint asset box. You got lots of definitions and interpretations. Here's my children means John Collins and any other child born to, because I clicked that future children box in the provisions tab. Here's my appointments, Lauren, if not Lauren, then Jordy. And then my disposition of body, here's my funeral arrangements. Then here's my special personal effects clause that gets generated. And when I gift the general personal effects to children in the second scenario, anytime I do that, gift to more than one beneficiary, it's going to generate this red mark. That's just to draw your attention because you need to make a decision here, whether you're going to leave the division of these personal effects up to the trustee's discretion, or if you're going to implement some sort of lottery system. So you can either take out A, B, and C, or you can keep it in, depending on what you want to do. Then here's your residue. So to Lauren, if not to Lauren, then this trust for the children. And then ultimately 50% to Jordy, 50% to Epilepsy Toronto. And then if you scroll to the bottom, here's your nice little will guide that's going to guide to the clauses in the will. So that's how you'd go through it. Then you'd go back to the system, you'd switch over to Lauren's. So to do that, you would just go up to here, you'd switch to Lauren. I would go through all of her things, just all the scenarios to make sure I hadn't missed anything there. And then I would generate her documents as well. And one last thing to note is this little question mark up in the top corner. So it can be a really good sort of resource if you're ever stuck on anything. If you click it, it'll bring you right over to our help desk where you can search through lots of articles on how to do different things in the system. How do I add a client? Here's a graphic, here's a video. So that can be really helpful. But also if you're ever stuck, don't hesitate to email support or email me directly. I'm always happy to help. So that's sort of it for today's session, but does anyone have any questions before we wrap up? No? Okay, well, if you do come across anything later, don't hesitate to reach out. But thanks again for joining me today, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.